Thank you all for coming to this talk, which is called Opera Jazz in Hollywood in the 1920s. My name is Jennifer Fleeger. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communication Studies at Ursinus College, and I teach film studies courses there primarily. I think it's more fun if during talks people ask questions and make comments, because I'm going to be showing a lot of clips and some of them are kind of crazy. So if I show them and you have a comment or a question, please ask that. I think it'll make the talk more enjoyable for everyone. What I'm going to be doing today is telling a story about how Hollywood learned to talk. But it's not the story that we traditionally know. The story that we hear quite often has to do with a little film made by Warner Brothers in 1927 called The Jazz Singer, in which Al Jolson does something like this.
I'm going to think it's jazzy. Now get this. Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but little blue sky. Do I see so.
And for some reason, that caused everyone in Hollywood to act like this.
Everybody go home and confirm the notice. What is this?
What's the matter, all right?
The Jazz Singer. That's what's the matter, the Jazz Singer.
Oh, my darling little mammy.
No joke, Cosmo. It's a sensation. The public is screaming for more.
For what?
Talking pictures. Talking pictures.
Ah, it's just a freak.
Yeah, what a freak. We should have such a freak at this studio. I told you talking pictures were a menace, but no one would listen to me. Don, we're going to put our best feet forward. We're going to make the dueling cavalier into a talking picture.
Talking picture? Well, that means I'm out of a job. At last I can start suffering and write that symphony.
So, like so many Hollywood versions of history, this one is not all that accurate. Theaters did not start converting to sound in large numbers immediately after the release of The Jazz Singer, partially because it was very expensive to convert a theater to sound. It cost between $6,000 and $24,000 per theater, so that's a lot of money to shell out for something that really didn't seem like a sure thing at all in 1927. The other problem here is that The Jazz Singer actually wasn't a talking picture, really. There were 8 talking sequences in The Jazz Singer, and the rest of the film operated very much like a silent film, with a recorded score that was played by a symphony and title cards that got put up throughout the film. And a lot of places in the United States where you would see The Jazz Singer, you would see something like this rather than what I just showed, which is a very different experience. And that's because The Jazz Singer was also released in a silent version, as well as a sound version, for those theaters that hadn't yet converted to sound. So a lot of places in the United States, this is what people would see. And this is a lot less convincing as something that you would want to be perpetuating as part of popular culture. Right? So the important thing about The Jazz Singer isn't that Al Jolson spoke, it's that Al Jolson sang. And singing, and primarily opera and jazz, were central to the creation of film sound from the very beginning. There were sound films in 1896. This is the kinetophone. It's a device invented by Edison, and these were placed in phonograph parlors, primarily in major cities, and where you would go and listen to records in public, but by yourself with little headphones. So here, this guy is watching a film, and the film is wound in that machine. So you can imagine there's not a whole lot of film strip you could fit into that device. So these films were about 30 seconds long, maybe up to a minute long. And the music that he would be hearing alongside it would be something that would be easily synchronized. So the kind of film he would be seeing would probably be something like this. This is Annabelle's Serpentine Dance. This is an Edison film from 1895. And you can imagine why this would be easily synchronized, because it doesn't really matter what music we play as long as it has a steady rhythm and it can keep going, right? It's going to work out relatively okay. The reason this is in color is because a lot of early films were hand-painted by teams of women who would color individual frames of the films. And so the color was just as much of a novelty as the music was that went along with it. So even though this is what Edison was producing, his dream was really to create filmed opera. One of the things that he famously said is this: "My intention is to have such a happy combination of photography and electricity that a man can sit in his own parlor and see depicted upon the curtain the forms of players in opera upon a distant stage and hear the voices of the singers." Really, this is a lot more like televised opera than cinematic opera. But if we think about the kinetophone and the way that people were watching films individually in 1896, this kind of statement coming 3 years earlier actually makes a lot of sense. So a lot of early filmmakers were interested in working with opera in some way. One of these was Alice Guy. Alice Guy was the very first woman filmmaker. She started making films for Gaumont in the late 1890s. And here she is using a Gaumont chronophone. So this is Alice Guy here in the front of the scene. And she's turning on the chronophone, and when she turns it on, the people start moving. How this worked was they would lip sync their words or their dances or whatever it was to the device, and then later during the projection phase, they would be synchronized so that it looked like the voices and the movements were matching perfectly. So Alice Guy moved to Cleveland in 1907 in order to market the chronophone, as you can see it here, in the United States. And it didn't sell very well, primarily because the amplification was quite poor. We had pretty big theaters, even not really so much in the 1900s, but a little bit later. Even the Nickelodeons were 150 to 200 seats. So a device like this wouldn't really be able to project all of that well. And there were synchronization problems, which was always an issue with sound pictures during this time. And so this is what one of them looked like. This is hand-tinted color from 1905, one of Alice Guy's photosets.
Bonjour, dites-moi, Rosine, ma belle voisine, vous venez dans tout ce bruit chez vous cette nuit. Vous battirez ma charlotte et puis vous souffrante. Je vous entendais gémir, n'ai pas pu dormir. Mais non, répond Rosinette, curieux que vous êtes, c'est très malhonnête. Qu'est-ce qui vous a pris? Le bruit qui vous a surpris, vient dans ma chambrette. C'est mon chat, du coup de minuit, quand Dieu l'a pourri.
You can see that the attraction here is that we're looking at his synchronized mouth moving, and that Felix Mayol was a pretty famous cafe singer in the early 1900s. So seeing him in this close manner was very exciting for people of that time.
Was that made in the United States?
No, in France. She made films in France until she moved to the United States in 1907, and then she ended up opening her own film studio called Solax in New Jersey in the early 1910s. But she always had to use her husband's name to back all of these projects. He was called Herbert Blanchet. And he was a bit of a scoundrel, so he left her for an actress and moved to Hollywood, bankrupting her, where she then returned to France with her 2 children, and died in relative obscurity writing children's stories. So that sucked. But we have now been able to find hundreds of her films and bring them back to the people, so that's also a very good thing. After Alice Guy, there were many real opera singers who tried out attempts at silent films. So Enrico Caruso made one called My Cousin in 1918, and we don't hear these singers at all in the films that they're making. They're silent films, so it's a little bit strange that there were so many opera singers who had or attempted to have careers in the cinema. This is a really bad film, actually. I don't recommend it, but it is on DVD if you want to see it. The cousin is a sculptor, and the real singer is without a mustache, and then they get mistaken for each other. Hijinks ensue. Mary Garden also attempted a film career. She wasn't particularly well received. But Geraldine Farrar, who was a Met opera diva and already very famous by 1915, starred in a number of Hollywood films. And here she is with her little dog, who I cannot believe I've forgotten his name. It was a very funny name, like Biscuit or something. She was quite flamboyant. This is a still from her film Maria Rosa, which was made in it was actually made before Carmen, but released after. I love this image. So when she came to Hollywood in 1915, the press marveled over the extravagance of her $20,000 summer contract, which, if you actually compare what she was making at the Met, is what she would have made at the Met in that 3-month period. But there was something about her being in Hollywood and the lifestyle that she got there. She had her own train car to carry her to and from California. She had a house, she had a chauffeur, she had servants. So there was a lot of amenities given to Farrar. She also ended up earning, by 1920, $150,000 a summer and getting 10% of each film's gross earnings. So she ended up doing quite well, even though her films didn't really do that well after the initial couple of years. Only one of her films was based on an opera, and that's Carmen. So this is a clip from Carmen. This is the first film she released, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. Oh, that's her contract, in case you didn't know. That's what really influenced how later productions of Carmen happened on the stage, because she famously punched the tenor here and tried to strangle the cigarette girl, and then she tried doing those things at the Met and got a lot of criticism for that. But the way that the film showed in New York in particular was really quite interesting. There was a live orchestra, of course, for most projections of this film, but there were also singers who stood behind the stage, and those singers were not Geraldine Farrar, but they were singing the parts. So the whole film score is arranged by Hugo Reisenfeld, who arranged a lot of film scores during this period. And it was mostly melodies from Carmen. Yes, Joe.
Is your sense that when they started inventing and synchronizing film and sound, that their goal was to try to capture opera and art, or was it more to try to capture like great ideas or great speakers? Or I mean, was there sort of a dichotomy?
There was also an attempt to capture great speakers, presidents. There was a film with George Bernard Shaw talking to the camera. So yes, for posterity, we want to capture important voices of the time. But with the evidence we have from Alice Guy and Edison and all of these people, we can see that it was really opera driving the cultural verification of cinema as an art form. Because early films didn't just show in cinemas. There weren't theaters that were devoted to film screening in the early days. So they showed in vaudeville houses, at cafes, sometimes out in the street. There would be filmmakers who would go and film, say, us here at the Phoenixville Library, and then we would all watch ourselves later that night after the film was produced. So in all kinds of places. And this, like hiring famous theater actresses to star in films, was one way of validating the cinema. Yeah.
What was it about the opera, though, that made it such a driving force?
I think because there was a kind of cultural cachet that opera had, but opera was very differently received in the early 20th century. It was, in fact, more of a popular art form than it is now. So people were really used to buying opera records, the famous Victor Red Seal label records that people would own, and having those as part of your collection was part of what made you a middle-class housewife in the early 1900s. So people were familiar with opera tunes, and putting opera tunes in films made sense because they would be popular and they would give class to the cinema. So Farrar did that for a lot of people in these days. She also marketed her film career in a very different way than her opera career. So this is a Geraldine Farrar Caramel Carmen Sundae that appeared, and it's a really recipe that even I could make. You put some ice cream in, you pour some caramel syrup on top, a marshmallow whip, and a cherry. So you can see that the fun way that she marketed her film career also had something to do with making the opera more accessible form to the public. So it's important to note that in spite of all this experimentation with sound, even with films like the George Bernard Shaw one that I mentioned earlier, it wasn't inevitable at all that sound films would end up talking. Warner Brothers, the same studio that made The Jazz Singer, and the first one to distribute sound films on a wide scale, had the idea to use sound to replace expensive theater musicians who cost quite a lot of money in the theaters that Warner Brothers owned. So when Warner Brothers made, when Warner Brothers made early films before The Jazz Singer, they were largely musical numbers, and theater musicians were very expensive. So, for example, there were 20,000 theater musicians in the United States in 1926. They made up 1/3 of the members of the AFM, the American Federation of Musicians at the time. So if you could get rid of those people for Warner Brothers' bottom line, that would make a lot of sense. Plus, you would get higher quality sound in the films that you're showing. So although there were picture palaces that had fantastic orchestras, there were also little towns that had pianists that maybe your uncle was playing, and he's not doing the greatest job. So if you can standardize all of that, you can get respect for your films and save money. And this is what Warner Brothers was initially trying to do. Here are some of the theater musicians that you may have seen in the early 20th century. This is around 1906. So you can see, if you look at the program here, there's going to be some pictures, some films, and then later on there's going to be a band concert. So it's all part of the same showing of entertainment to the public in Washington, Iowa. Here we have Cavella's Orchestra in Denver around 1920. So this one's a little bit bigger. This is the Princess Theater, which was a Paramount-owned theater. And here are some people making a Wurlitzer organ in London. So another idea that, unfortunately, theater owners had for replacing the orchestra was to have an organ, and then you have all the sounds of the orchestra, but using an organ to do so. There were also a lot of phonograph sales about special devices that you could use recorded sounds to replace theater musicians. So what did Warner Brothers do? In 1926, they, with Western Electric, adopted a machine called the Vitaphone. And this is the Vitaphone. here. It was a little bit like the Gaumont chronophone that I showed earlier. And this synchronized what looks a lot like phonograph records to a film strip, but in a more reliable way than the chronophone or any of those other earlier experiments with sound had done before. The very first Warner Brothers sound program was released about a year before The Jazz Singer on August 6, 1926. And it didn't feature a talking film at all, but rather a score with some sound effects. This was for the film Don Juan, starring John Barrymore. So you can hear the sounds of swords clashing, but nobody actually speaks in that film. I'm going to show you a little bit of the score. The score was recorded by the New York Philharmonic, and again arranged by Hugo Reisenfeld together with another composer called William Max. No idea. So we better stop there. So this is a leitmotivic score, which means each character has a theme, and it was through compose and followed a lot of traditions that were happening in silent films and palaces at the time, and that we later have in classical Hollywood cinema, and then in blockbuster films like Star Wars and all of the John Williams scores. However, Don Juan, even though this is fantastic, right, and obviously very funny and beautifully played, did not get the most attention from critics or audiences on August 6, 1926. What people really raved about were the short films that were shown before this one, which were primarily classical musical numbers, violinists, and opera singers. And the one that everybody loved the most is the one I'm going to show now. This is Giovanni Martinelli, who was Caruso's successor, I think that's the Grand Prince, they called him, singing Vestila Juba from I Pagliacci. So we'll see a little bit of him doing that. And I'll say something. The quality on this is not that great because I stole it from YouTube since they don't have these. You can also see them in Wisconsin at the Historical Society, but obviously I couldn't steal it from them.
Pure
Bravo.
You can see, people were really excited about that, giving it standing ovations, raving about it in the press. Something funny happened about these films, though, in that Warner Brothers ended up making 65 of these opera shorts. That's quite a lot, between 1926 and 1932. Other studios made a few opera shorts, 2 or 3, but Warner Brothers was really devoted to this project. And that's partially because the rhetoric of that studio at the time was that they were bringing good music to the people of the United States, democratizing the opera, and they were doing this explicitly. But it didn't really work all that well when they were using women's voices. So in the early couple of years of these opera film production, we have women singing, we have men singing, we have men and women singing together, we have quartets, and usually they're Italian arias that are pretty familiar to people or easily accessible. Very rarely do they sing German arias, never something that's not from the 19th century. But the same night that this film was shown, we had this film by Marion Talley, who was billed as, and I think it's important, the youthful prima donna of the New York Metropolitan. So we already know right away, we're looking at a body here, not just listening to a voice. And what happens is the opera films starring women end up being shot very differently. That film that we just saw with Giovanni Martinelli had one shot, right? A long shot of him. He's performing. It's like we're replicating a stage performance. Marion Talley's on a stage, too, as you'll see in a second. There's her stage. These are all shot at the Manhattan Opera House, which ended up being a problem because there was a subway that went under it. So if this were going to be like the one we just saw, that would be the shot that we have the whole time. But it's not.
These are no longer synchronized, these are live. I mean, it's
Recorded live, yes.
there's an orchestra in the background.
Exactly, orchestra on the scene. Yeah. What happened with this film was that critics said she sounded like tightly locked subway brakes screeching. All kinds of really negative things about poor Marion Talley. I think part of the problem was actually the cutting of the film, the expectations of her image, and the acting job right here. There's no one standing there, right? And everybody knows it. So this film ended up being cut from circulation. And this happened to a lot of subsequent films starring women. Ernestine Schumann-Hink, who was a German contralto. They didn't like the way she sang in German, but that was her language, right? She spoke German. So she wasn't allowed to record any more Vitaphone films after she made a couple of this. There were definite ideas about how women should sound and how women ought to be presented, and Marion Talley didn't fit that. She eventually did become the face of Rye Crisp Cracker, though, and went on an intensive weight loss program in the mid-1930s and attempted to make a comeback in a really terrible film that you can watch on archive.org if you want, called Follow Your Heart. I don't recommend it, but if you want to see poor Marion Talley. So, as Joe asked, these films were shot with multiple cameras in a single day. Here you can see, if you can kind of see, how this was operating. So it's a very difficult process. So these are the 3 cameras, and they're in these giant booths because cameras make a lot of noise. So you had to build soundproof booths to house them. And you couldn't really move them around like you did in the earlier part of the 20s because they made so much noise. So the shots were really boring in the early sound era. The orchestra's on set over here. There's a boom mic on the couple that we're shooting. So we're shooting him with this one, her with that one, coverage with the middle one, and then eventually we'll cut it to the sound recording that was made. So this was a very arduous process, shooting these.
Is that still Warner Brothers?
These are still Warner Brothers, yeah. I don't have any examples here from the other studios, but the other studios used a sound on disc process. Let's see if I can find. Or sorry, a sound on film strip. These are contract. Here. So other studios use either a variable density or a variable width system, and you can see how that would be synchronized a lot easier because the strip and the image are together in the machine, and it wasn't as complicated to produce that as it was to produce a Vitaphone short. So the perception was, with this kind of shooting process, that the orchestra members needed to be paid a lot more money, and so they negotiated a higher contract for these things. So these were very expensive to make, and it's kind of amazing that Warner Brothers did keep making them. through 1932. However, what I want to point out is that the style of these films and the jazz films that Warner Brothers produced really was quite similar. So you can see most of the films start with a long shot, like we have at the top. We cut to closer shots when people are singing, and then even closer shots when we're emphasizing something about their voice or about their instrument. So really, what ends up happening is that even though we're presenting opera as a high cultural product, we end up equating it with other popular musics, like with jazz. This also happens, this is a Vitaphone release index. So if you owned a movie theater in 1927, 28, and you had a Vitaphone system, you would be given a big catalog of all the films you could order at any time. And you would program your evening based on what you thought your audiences would like to see. In that big catalog, films are not separated by opera, jazz, comedy acts, film scores. They're all put together on an individual page. So we have the idea that all of this is a kind of musical democracy available for people to see. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about jazz because I've been segueing into that. Although Warner Brothers was the studio most interested in producing opera shorts, all of the majors made jazz films. But the films that each of them made and how each defined jazz were very different. The Hollywood studios were in a fierce competition at the end of the 1920s over which sound technology would dominate the American film industry, the Vitaphone, the sound on disc, or the two sound on film systems that I showed earlier. And it mattered which of these won, because it meant that one of the systems would become obsolete, all of the theaters would have to standardize to the other one, and the studio sound technology and the films that it produced would have to be converted into the other system. So Warner Brothers had an early lead with films like The Jazz Singer and Don Juan. But as the other major studios made a commitment to sound in 1928 and 29, it became clear that there was going to be intense competition. In the late 1920s, jazz music had several connotations: energy and liveliness, physical movement, mechanization, Americanness, and of course, a racial connotation as well. The representation of jazz in each of the studio's short films said something about how it thought its sound system and the ideals that each studio promised to uphold. In all cases, jazz was being used to make a case to the American public about the value of sound cinema at a time when its visual aesthetics were returning to relative stagnancy. So one way to get that energy back that's lost when you have to have cameras sitting around a big sound booth is to have lively music to go along with it. And this is one of the functions that jazz served. So I'm going to show clips from 3 films made by 3 different studios to illustrate the different ways that each defined jazz and used jazz to talk about the values of its sound system. First, we're going to look at Warner Brothers, since I've been talking about Warner Brothers. Jazz for Warner Brothers was typically produced by white musicians in a grand ballroom with a chandelier. And these musicians would be singing old songs from the American South. And in those songs, they would be crediting the original producers of that music as usually African-American Southerners. So it's a very weird transmission of authorship here that we're going to be seeing. So this might not sound very much like jazz to what we would define jazz now. But it's important to remember that jazz at the time often just meant popular music with a slightly syncopated rhythm. And if that weren't true, nothing in The Jazz Singer would be jazz, right? But Al Jolson thought that Bright Eyes was jazz, and so did people who saw that movie, so even though you wouldn't say so now. So this first is going to be Paul Tremaine and his Aristocrats. I don't think the title of this band is any accident. 1929.
All aboard!
Can't you
Sorry?
He doesn't look
No, I
No,
mean,
he doesn't.
the energy comes from the music, not the image, right? And not even the way that these people are singing it. This looks very different than jazz at the other studios. The Warner Brothers version is a really conservative understanding of jazz, and a good example of how jazz is being employed by Warner Brothers to suggest the past. It's an old song I've been working on the rail that everybody knows. The power of machines, so there's a train, an allusion to mechanization and modernity, and American folklore. So this band, like many in the Warner Brothers films, features a banjoist up front. It's not essential that we hire films with banjos and place them at the front. That's a choice that's being made by the band and by the director here. So this conservatism suited Warner's well, since the Vitaphone was marketed as a technology of the past. When you see ads for the Vitaphone in trade journals of this time, they're talking about it like a phonograph, a device that's familiar to everyone. We all know how the phonograph works. It's a safe device. You have one in your house. So going to see a film with a Vitaphone is just like being at home, except you get better culture. So it's a conservative kind of ideology that we're getting here. So therefore, it wasn't only its reappropriation of African-American musical traditions that made jazz safe for consumption. The studio needed to remind the public that its technology enhanced the capabilities of the phonograph, and it talked about that a lot. It's better than a phonograph. We have images to go with it now. So this is the kind of thing we have from Warner Brothers. Jazz shorts that rejoined the signifiers of music created for African-American audiences, and the style that was sold to white Southerners, and redirected that combination toward the middle class in a ballroom with a lovely chandelier. Jazz looked really different at Paramount. So Paramount shorts featured famous performers using their real names in fictionalized stories. Some examples of this are Louis Armstrong in Rhapsody in Black and Blue. I'll show an example from that in a second. Cab Calloway, who appeared in a few shorts, as well as in the Betty Boop shorts as a walrus. So he's Cab Calloway, but he's also and Rudy Valley in a crazy film called The Musical Doctor, where he cures people of nervous disorders by singing into a megaphone. It's a shame that doesn't work, but anyway. So Louis Armstrong once said that anything you can express to the public is jazz. The Paramount films are quite conflicted about what the studios could express to the public, as you'll see. The stars featured in them make the music seem authentic, yet they're often involved in disreputable schemes as part of the plots of these things. So we're discrediting them at the same time as we're using them to say, hey, this is actually jazz, what you're seeing here. They take possession of the music, but they do succumb to racist stereotypes, which is probably the most true of Louis Armstrong. He's wearing a leopard skin in the film that we're going to see in a second. I do want you to look at the difference, though, between the way Louis Armstrong sings and the way he plays the trumpet. There's an incredible difference in the use of his body and the agency that he seems to take when he puts the trumpet to his lips. So we'll see Rhapsody in Black and Blue. There's a very basic harmony scene where this guy gets hit and falls asleep.
Yes, sir. You ain't no good at all, boy. You have to dream my face, trying to bite me in the back of my wife, you old dog. Look at that. I want to tell it to you. Check it out. Now, I'll be glad when you're dead, you Rhapsody. I'll be glad when you're dead, you Rhapsody. And I brought you to my home, you would leave my wife alone. I'll be glad when you're dead, you Rhapsody. I will be glad when you're dead, you Rhapsody. I'll be tickling death when you leave this ugly dog. If I took you for my friend, the way you picked me the back was a sin. You ain't no good, you Rhapsody. What is that? Look out there. Yeah. Look out there, baby. Right now. You wanna go there? Yeah. Yeah. Look out there. As I said before, I'll be glad when you're dead, you Rhapsody. Boy, when you lay 6 feet deep, no more fried chicken with you. I know that'll break your heart. Yeah. You know good that. Yeah. Right it. You ever call it that. Hey. Oh, that's your look. You ain't no good, you Rhapsody. Yeah, you got it. Boy, you ain't one of boy. Boy, what is it that you got? That makes my wife think you hot. Oh, you old dog. Yeah. You bought my wife a bottle of Coca-Cola so you could play on her Victrola. You old dog. You old dog.
About the difference in the trumpet performance and the singing, right? A friend of mine named Prim Gabbard wrote an article talking about this performance as a kind of phallic masculinity. It's kind of obvious to see how that's true.
But you couldn't really assail his singing as less than
high
quality.
But he was often criticized at this time for playing into the buffoonish stereotype of the African American.
Just sonically, like just tonally, the way he improvises with his voice, it's quite amazing. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, and there's lots of good stuff written about him and the origins of scat singing and all of these things. So we could read it as that is taking possession and a kind of signifying. And Henry Louis Gates' words on jazz singing. I think that's possible to do, but you can still see. So Paramount films all look something like this, which is very different from how the Warner Brothers films looked. Worlds inhabited by jazz musicians that are inside other worlds. This one's a dream. But one thing Paramount consistently does is highlight its own production facilities. So sometimes we see that in the credit sequence. You're being told that this is made in a Paramount studio. So even if the jazz is in a fictional world, someplace like Jazzmania here, we can be sure that the jazz recorded at Paramount is being carefully selected for Americans' greatest cultural benefit. So the studio seems to be asserting. So this is the last example of the jazz films. And this comes from MGM, and it's definitely the weirdest. MGM had this group of performers it called the MGM Dancing Girls, which are exactly what it sounds like. And they were often showed accompanying its jazz numbers. So again, this is pre-code, and you'll see why. So that means prior to 1934, there was a lot more sex and violence in American cinema production than we get from that time until the 1960s. This film, like many produced by MGM, uses female sexuality, which is another of jazz's connotations, to suggest the power of the music. So two of the films dealing with these MGM dancing girls are called The Devil's Cabaret, that's the one I'm going to show, and Over the Counter. And in both of them, jazz is used to rescue a floundering business, which, reading as an allegory for MGM in the 1930s, is kind of easy, right? So in The Devil's Cabaret, Satan has had a hard time getting people to be bad and go to hell, and so they bust out the dancing girls to get people interested. Right? So,
Beware! Where you be? All ye! Who went down here?
Don't mind him, folks. Come on with me. There's not a thing to fear. I've given Satan souvenirs to you, and you, and you.
Follow him not. You'll be sorry if you do.
Take off your Sunday best dress. Cut out the eye team. Put on your bestest vest and on it up with me. We'll stop the night for dancing, playing with TNT. Later we'll all get blazing, so come on it up, red hot it up, come on it up with me.
Everybody goes to hell and Satan's well, that's right. As Robert Allen wrote with regard to 19th century American theater, all that had been repressed and the righteous, moral, conservative middle class's conquest of the theater returned in burlesque. The exposure of the MGM dancing girls, I think, reveals the crass commercial strain of jazz that had been elided in both the Warner Brothers performance shorts and the narrative exploits of Paramount. As anonymous visual pageantry, jazz served MGM's spectacular brand image, while at the same time undermining its concentration on quality star productions exhibited by its feature films. The result was a conflicted appropriation of popular song that conveyed visually the potential for disturbances in the flow of capitalist production, purportedly alleviated by the film's narrative conclusions. In other words, the films ended happily, right? Hell is now inhabited, stores are prevented from closing. But the thing we remember about these films, and the thing they're explicitly asking us to remember, has nothing to do with a story at all. It's even with jazz music. It's the image of the dancing girl, right? So it's that thing that disrupts everything about the narrative that we're seeing. Even though I've been highlighting the differences between opera and jazz throughout, I have one more clip that I'd like to show that seems to combine them. Because they were respectively used to emphasize cultural values and energy, liveliness, modernity, mechanisms, things that don't really tend to go together. But there was an interesting film produced by Warner Brothers called Yamacraw. Yamacraw was a symphonic jazz rhapsody composed by Harlem Stride pianist James P. Johnson, who you can see here playing the piano. And it was written as a response to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. So Johnson wrote it to be played by Fats Waller, who performed it along with an orchestra at Carnegie Hall in 1928, which is the same place where Gershwin's Rhapsody premiered 4 years earlier. Warner Brothers took that Rhapsody and made a film about it. And the version that we hear in the film is a little bit different. There's voices that have been added, which I think is significant because they're rather operatic, the voices that we hear in this film. And it's asynchronous. So everything we've been seeing so far really emphasizes the synchronicity. The voices are producing themselves as we see them being produced. This one is very different. This film has 84 shots, which is really strange for a Warner Brothers short produced in 1930. It's about 10 minutes long, so one reel. Most of these were one reel long. And it uses a German expressionism, the kind of visual tropes from that time, to talk about a southern village. And there is a lot of racial stereotyping that goes on here too, so I'll say that as well. Of course, there's racism. But it's a strange combination. see there's a kind of operatic suggestion going on with the voices and the visual style, and then we have our origins of the piece, which is a symphonic jazz piece. I think this film, Yamacraw, sends a message about the potential combination of opera and jazz on screen, and about the Vitaphone as the voice of America, which it desperately wanted to be. This is what Warner Brothers was hoping for. It expresses the importance of great music, lively entertainment, and the preservation and distribution of cultural products, all values that the film industry was juggling as it attempted to integrate sound into its films. Yamacraw demonstrates that rather than being situated on opposite sides of an indissoluble barrier between high and low art, opera and jazz share a history as essential parts of American popular culture in the early 20th century. Combining opera and jazz, as theaters did when they showed these films as part of the same evening program, or as studio composers would eventually do by integrating them into the same film score, proved to be an economic success, tapping into key sounds that interested investors and the public, and enabling the major studios to carve out an aesthetic identity for American film sound. So that's the end of what I have to say. That you would like to ask?
How do you think that played into the time? Because that was just about the start of the Great Depression.
Yes.
And I think that that kind of entertainment options may have been furthered or forced by the economic situation that was prevailing at the time.
Yeah, so when studios decided to make the transition to sound, it was around 1928 to 1929 when everybody made the plunge, which was right before the crash. So then they were devoted to this thing, and then most of the major studios went bankrupt in the beginning of the Depression. So it was a problem having to convert all of the theaters and deal with these sound products. I think the diversity of entertainment models was also thought of as a solution because 15,000 theater musicians lost their jobs also as part of the Depression. And they started striking and having boycotts and all of these kinds of things. So there were a lot of conflicts around theater music and what was happening. And so I think the studios understood it as both the problem and hopefully eventually the solution to gaining audiences again. Louise.
I know you ended with a bit of a different argument, but you had said earlier when you were focusing on opera that it was perhaps legitimizing of the new medium to have a higher art form represented. And I'm wondering what you think about more contemporary moves by the Met to telecast in cinemas today. If there's some sort of a reversal going on now, or what do you think that's about?
Yeah, I think the Met is having really big financial problems, and so that was also thought of as one of the solutions, and it's maybe not working out so well for them either. A lot of theater companies are trying that too, for simulcasting. Simulcasting also isn't new. That was attempted in the 1920s with radio broadcasts in movie theaters. So this is kind of a common idea. Let's turn to the cinema, an established institution, and see if we can get something working out with the live theater over there. So I think there's a similar idea about democratizing the opera. The Met has had that periodically. Otto Kahn, who used to be executive director of the Met in the 1920s, had this idea that if we could just produce jazz operas, maybe then we would be able to get more of the public interested in opera. So I think the Met has been leaning in that way, but most people recognize the Met as a high cultural institution that's out of reach for all of them.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about the choice, especially in Yamacraw, for using an African American family and that plot, because it's probably for a middle class white audience.
Yeah, definitely. If you read trade journals from the late 1920s, you'll find a real fetishization of the African American voice. It's that, right? We're now able to hear the
Renaissance writ large. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So female voices are out of reach. They're too high pitched. They're out of the range. And now there's a kind of effort to use African American singing to authenticate the value of the medium. Yeah.
Do you think the technology drove the new ideas and things like that? Apart from economic and the society requirement of entertainment and other things?
I don't really think so. I'm always really hesitant to go to a technological determinist position. I think it helps that we have now vacuum amplifiers that make it possible for people to hear stuff. But the idea of creating a film opera was something that people were constantly trying to do. The idea of creating a film jazz piece was not, because jazz didn't exist in 1895. But I think it seemed normal to create a film with music because that's something that had been done already since 1896.
Like in the 20th century, the technology also, developed in various stages, and that helped development in various sectors, including the
Absolutely. And Lee DeForest, who was one of the pioneers of radio, also had a very early synchronous sound system. Before Warner Brothers, his was in 1923, and he too made a lot of opera and jazz films. But those were not as popular. That system didn't sell well for some reason. He didn't market it very well, so it had problems. But you're absolutely right. Innovations for cinema sound came from all over the place. From Western Electric, from the idea of the telephone, from people who were creating loudspeakers.
That we see even today, like we have in last 120 years, we have come, that we see such a great development. Yeah, thank you.
That's a good point.
So if you were going to the movies in the period that you're talking about, how aware would you have been of like the different kinds of sound systems? Would you notice the difference between seeing a Vitaphone movie and one of the other systems?
Movie tone or a phonofilm. That was a really real problem that the studios were trying to circumvent in their advertising. So one of them had a famous quotation, like, which audience is going to know a Vitaphone from a vitamin? We're really aware of these kinds of things. And so part of the branding of the studio sound systems, I think, was to create very different visual and oral aesthetics and definitions of jazz and uses of opera to distinguish themselves. But exhibitors were always told to put see and hear before any advertisement of a sound film, whether it was Vitaphone, movie tone, or a phonofilm. Joe?
A little interested in the tradition of silence in the audience. Was it assumed at all these movies that the audience in the 20s was silent for the film the whole time?
Yeah, the taming of the audience took place in the 1910s. So before that, there were a lot of riotous environments in movie theaters, and I think they were probably a lot more fun. People used to sing in the movies. In the Nickelodeons, there would be these beautiful song slides hand-painted by women with lyrics, and the niece maybe of the pianist would come and sing a song, and everyone in the audience would sing along, and it was a way of selling popular sheet music. So it used to be like that. People would talk back, they would sing a lot. And then the studios were a little bit upset because the artistic quality of their films they felt was being undermined by pianists who would do jokes. So if there was like a beautiful melodramatic homecoming and the pianist is going home on the range, right, they would laugh. And suddenly the film is not as respected. So the effort to standardize sound was, I think, a little bit simultaneous with the effort to tame an audience and gain respect for the film. This is my daughter. Yeah.
Is there any information about what happened to all those thousands of musicians that had to find a new way once the technology changed?
Yeah, there's a book that was written, and I can't remember who wrote it now, about those theater musicians and what happened with the strikes that they produced. I mean, some of them did find jobs in the studios, but 15,000 musicians are not going to settle for jobs in 1930, so I don't really know. That's a great question. I think one of them suffered, like musicians do now.
There was a trumpet player who was a contemporary of Louis Armstrong, and he was quite famous at the time, but then he ended up working as a car lot attendant in Milwaukee for Avis Rental Car in the 70s. Yeah.
Wow.
That's one story.
There you go. Thank you all very much for coming. Have a good evening.